David Letterman's pen fell from his hand when Richard Pryor suddenly stopped laughing mid-joke and said 5 words that silenced the entire studio. "I tried to kill myself." Paul Schaefer's keyboard went dead silent. The audience forgot how to breathe. And for the next 13 minutes, the funniest man in America didn't tell a single joke. Instead, he told the truth about pain, about addiction, about being black in a white industry, and about using laughter as a weapon to survive. What happened that night wasn't comedy. It was confession, and it would haunt everyone who witnessed it. It was a Tuesday night in March 1986, and Late Night with David Letterman was in its 4th year on NBC. The show had found its voice as the edgy alternative to traditional talk shows. David Letterman, 39 years old with his curly brown hair and ironic smile, sat behind his wooden desk in Studio 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, reviewing his notes before the next segment. The monologue had been solid. The audience was warm. Paul Schaefer and the band were locked in. Everything felt right. Letterman glanced at his cue cards for the next guest and felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Richard Pryor, the greatest stand-up comedian alive, a legend, but also someone who'd been through hell in the past few years. The freebasing accident in 1980 when he'd set himself on fire, the multiple marriages, the struggles with addiction, the health problem. "Is he okay to do this?" Letterman had asked his producer earlier that day. He insisted. The producer said, "Called us himself. Said he had something he wanted to talk about. Should I avoid certain topics?" He said no restriction. He wants to be honest. That made Letterman nervous. Richard Pryor being completely honest could go anywhere. 30 seconds, the stage manager called out. Letterman straightened his tie, took a breath, and looked into the camera as the red light blinked on. "Welcome back," Letterman said. "Our next guest is someone I've admired my entire career. He's the funniest person I've ever seen on stage. He's a comedy legend. He's Richard Pryor." The audience erupted into massive applause and cheers. People were on their feet before Richard even appeared. Paul Schaefer hit a funky, confident groove on the keyboard, and the band launched into an upbeat rhythm. And from backstage, moving with that distinctive Richard Pryor energy, he walked out. He was 45 years old, thin, wearing a burgundy leather jacket over a black shirt and jeans. His face showed the years, the pain, the battles. There were scars on his neck and arms from the fire, but his eyes were sharp, alert, present. The standing ovation continued. Richard smiled, waved, did a little shuffle step that made the audience go even wilder. He reached Letterman, and they shook hands warmly. There was genuine affection between them. "Richard, thank you for being here," Letterman said, and the respect in his voice was clear. "Thanks for having me, baby," Richard said. His voice was a little raspy but unmistakably his. They sat down. Richard settled into the guest chair, crossing one leg over the other, looking relaxed but also somehow coiled, like he was ready to spring in any direction. "How are you feeling?" Letterman asked. "I'm alive," Richard said with a slight smile. "That's more than I expected a few years ago." The audience laughed, but nervously. They weren't sure if that was a joke or not. Letterman leaned forward. "Let's talk about that. What you went through in 1980, the accident. Can you talk about it?" Richard was quiet for a moment. His expression shifted from the performance smile to something more real, more vulnerable. "It wasn't an accident," Richard said. The studio went completely silent. The smile disappeared from Letterman's face. "What do you mean?" Letterman asked carefully. Richard looked directly at him. "I mean, I tried to kill myself, Dave. I poured rum all over my body and lit myself on fire. It wasn't an accident. It was a suicide attempt." The audience gasped. Some people put their hands over their mouths. The silence was profound. Letterman's eyes were wide. "Richard, I don't know if you should. I should." Richard interrupted gently. "That's why I'm here, to tell the truth. I've been lying about it for 6 years, calling it an accident, letting people think I was just high and stupid. But it was more than that. I was in so much pain that I wanted to die, and I almost succeeded." Paul Schaefer had stopped moving entirely at his keyboard, staring at Richard. Letterman's voice was soft when he spoke. "What kind of pain?" Richard took a deep breath. "Every kind. Physical pain from years of abusing my body. Emotional pain from failed relationships, from a childhood that broke me, from carrying trauma I never dealt with, and the pain of being Richard Pryor." "What does that mean?" Letterman asked. "It means everyone thinks they know me because they've seen me on stage," Richard said. "They think I'm this funny guy, this wild guy, this guy who says outrageous things and makes people laugh. But that's not me. That's a character I created to survive. The real me? The real Richard? He's scared. He's lonely. He's angry. And he's exhausted from performing all the time. The studio was absolutely silent now. This wasn't what anyone expected. This wasn't comedy. This was something else entirely. "Why are you telling us this now?" Letterman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of lying," Richard said. "I'm tired of pretending everything's funny. I'm tired of using humor to deflect from pain. And I'm tired of watching other people, especially other black entertainers, go through the same shit I went through without anyone talking about it honestly." What Richard said next would change everything in the room. Richard uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The relaxed posture was gone. Now he was intense, focused, present. "Can I tell you what it's like to be a black comedian in a white industry?" Richard asked. Letterman nodded. "Please. It's like being a dancing monkey," Richard said bluntly. "They want you to be funny, but not too real. They want you to talk about race, but not too angrily. They want you to be authentic, but only in ways that make white people comfortable." He paused, looking out at the audience. "I spent years trying to figure out how to be funny enough to succeed but black enough to maintain my dignity. And you know what I learned? You can't do both. The industry doesn't want your dignity. They want your performance. They want you to shuffle and jive and make them laugh at your pain. And if you refuse, if you demand to be seen as a complete human being, they call you difficult. They call you angry. They stop hiring you." His voice was getting stronger, more passionate. "I've been called the N-word more times than I can count by executives, producers, directors who thought it was fine because we were friends. I've had to smile through meetings where white men told me how black people think, how black people talk, how black people should behave on screen. I've had to watch white comedians steal my material, my style, my rhythm, and give more credit for it than I ever did." The audience was riveted. Some people were crying. Others sat with their mouths open. Letterman's eyes were glistening. "Richard, I had no idea." "Nobody does," Richard said, "because we're not allowed to talk about it. Because the moment we start telling the truth about what it's like to be black in Hollywood, we become political. We become divisive. We become unemployable." He looked directly into the camera. "But I don't care anymore. I almost died. I set myself on fire because the pain of existing in this industry, in this country, as a black man was too much to bear. And if I'm still here, if I survive that, then I owe it to other people to tell the truth." The silence was deafening. Richard stood up suddenly. Letterman looked startled but didn't try to stop him. Richard walked to the front of the stage, toward the audience. The cameras scrambled to follow. "How many black people are in this audience?" Richard asked. A handful of hands went up. "Maybe 15 out of 200 people." Richard nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. That's what it's always like. I perform for majority white audiences every night. I make white people laugh at black pain, and I've made millions of dollars doing it. But you know what? I've paid a price that no amount of money can cover." He turned back to face Letterman and the cameras. "I've paid with my dignity. I've paid with my mental health. I've paid with my body, which I destroyed with drugs because it was the only way I could numb the pain of being a clown for people who would never see me as equal." His voice cracked slightly. "And the worst part is, I'm one of the lucky. I made it. I became famous. I became rich. But how many brilliant black comedians never got the chance? How many died broke, forgotten, because they wouldn't compromise their dignity for white approval?" The audience was completely still. Several people were openly weeping now. Richard walked slowly back toward the stage but stopped halfway. He stood in the aisle, looking at the people around him. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 7 years old," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "I grew up in my grandmother's brothel in Peoria, Illinois. My mother was a prostitute. My father was a pimp. And when I was 7, I watched a white man beat my mother bloody because she asked for her money." He paused, his jaw working. "And you know what I did? I made a joke. Even at 7 years old, I knew that humor was the only weapon I had. I couldn't fight that man. I couldn't protect my mother, but I could make him laugh. And when he laughed, he stopped hitting her." His eyes were wet now. "That's where my comedy comes from. It comes from survival. It comes from turning pain into performance so I don't have to feel it. And I've been doing it for 38 years. And I'm so tired." Letterman had stood up from behind his desk. He walked toward Richard, meeting him in the aisle. They stood face to face. "Richard," Letterman said, his voice thick, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Richard said. "Just listen. Just bear witness." because that's all I need. I don't need sympathy. I don't need pity. I just need people to know the truth." And then Richard said something that would echo for decades. Richard looked at Letterman, then at the camera. "I'm going to tell you why I really set myself on fire," he said, "and I need everyone to hear this." The studio went still. I was in my house in Northridge, high on cocaine, staring at myself in the mirror, and I realized I'd become everything I hated. A product, a thing that existed to make people laugh, to make money, to make others comfortable. His voice shook. I'd lost Richard somewhere along the way, the scared kid who wanted to be loved, who wanted to matter. In his place was Richard Pryor, the commodity, and I hated him. I hated that I had sold my pain for profit, turned my trauma into entertainment. Tears streamed down his face, so I poured rum on myself and lit a match. I thought maybe if I destroyed this body everyone wanted, I could finally be free. He paused, and while I was burning, running down the street on fire, I thought, I don't want to die. I want to live, but I want to live as myself, not as the product. The audience sobbed. Letterman stood frozen, crying openly. "I'm telling you this," Richard said, "because there are people out there destroying themselves for success. Fame isn't worth your life. Money isn't worth your soul." He looked straight into the camera. "If you're watching and you're in pain, please don't give up. The industry will try to break you. Society will try to define you, but you are more than what they want you to be. Your life matters." The studio rose in a standing ovation, quiet, reverent, tearful. Letterman hugged him. "Thank you," Letterman said. "No," Richard replied. "Thank you for letting me be human." Richard walked off stage. The applause continued long after he disappeared. Letterman faced the camera. "That was Richard Pryor," he said hoarsely. "The bravest thing I've ever seen on television. We're ending the show here. Silence is the only thing that fits." The next morning, NBC received over 25,000 phone calls. Most weren't complaints. "Richard Pryor saved my life. I was going to kill myself today. Now I'm getting help. That was the most important television I've ever seen." The episode aired once more with mental health resources, then was archived. The impact was immediate. Suicide hotlines reported a massive spike in calls. Addiction treatment centers saw record interest. Conversations about mental health, especially in the Black community, moved into the mainstream. Richard received hundreds of thousands of letters. One, from a 19-year-old Black comedian, said, "I watched with my father. We cried and talked for hours. It was the first honest conversation we ever had." Richard kept that letter for the rest of his life. Years later, Letterman said, "That was the most important episode we ever did. Richard used our platform to save lives. That's what television should be." After Richard Pryor's death, NBC released a 10-minute clip online. It went viral, viewed by tens of millions. The full episode remains unreleased. Those who were there never forgot it. Paul Schaefer later said, "That night, Richard stopped being a comedian and became a teacher. He showed us that laughter and pain live together, and that truth is sometimes braver than humor." In one of his final interviews, Richard was asked if he'd change anything about that night. "No," he said, "that was the realest I've ever been. The truth mattered more than the laughs." In Letterman's office hangs a photo from that night. Richard in the guest chair, tears on his face, utterly unguarded. Beside it is a note Richard sent days later. "Thank you for letting me be broken on your show. That night, I stopped performing and started healing." Letterman reads it often, and he remembers the night Richard Pryor stopped being funny and started telling the truth. The night comedy became confession. The night vulnerability became permission. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't make people laugh. It's make them feel less alone. Richard Pryor did that, and it changed lives.